Kia ora koutou, kia ora tātou. Ko io te kore, ko te mea harini rini, ko te mai roa. Mutuna kore ti mata kore, ko ia tōku mātaurana, ko ia tōku māramatana, ko ia tōku kaiāwhina, ko ia tōku whatunakau, ko ia tōku orana mutuna kore. Thy Supreme Voidan, who is the Holy Gracing Graceman, thy everlasting statement of no conclusion, of no beginning, who is my spiritual knowledge, who is my personal assistant, who is my spiritual heart, who is my well-being, never ending. Embraceth, gathereth, anointeth. Kia koe, o tene.
Kia hiwara, kia hiwara. Kia hiwara ki tēnei tuku, kia hiwara ki tērā tuku, kia tū, kia ho, kia matāra e. E aku nui, e aku iti, kua whakarongo nei ki tēnei mihi, tēnei te mihi kia kouta, nau mai, hara mai, hoki mai. Whakarongo mai ki ngā kōrero, ki tēnei rangi, i runga te tēpū nei, e pāna ki ngā kaupapa katoa. Nō reira, e ngā mana, i ngā reo, rauranga tira mā, ka hari te koa o tēnei kai kōrero, ki te mihi ki a koutou i roto tēnei rangi. Ka whiti te rā, e rā anō pā tātou. Nō reira, mihi tonu ki tō tātou nei matunu te rangi, te tīmatanga ki te whakautinga o ngā mea katoa. Kororia ki tōna ingoa tapu rawa. Nō reira, mihi tonu ki a koe te rangatira e rihari. Nau anō, e hono te ture wairua ki te ture tangata. Nō reira, ka mihi anō. Huri atu ki tō tātou nei kingi Māori. A kingi tū heitia, po te tau te wherowhero te tuawhitu, ka noho ana ia i runga te ahurewa tapu o ngā mātua, o ngā tūpuna. Kia rātou te kāhui āriki, ki rire hau, pai mārire.
Pai mārire.
Nā, ka huri anō kia rātou kua wheturahi tia. Rātou, kua kawe a mātou, kia rātou, i roto a mātou ngai ngākau, hina ngaro i ara. I tonu ki a rātou te kāhui wairua, haere koutou, mai rā. Rātou ki a rātou, te hungomate ki te hungomate, tātou ki a tātou. Ngā waihotanga o rātou mā. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou ngā, e te mininga, kua tae. Tēnei hui nui, ai rā te mihi ki a koutou. Hare mai. Nō reira, kāre tōro a taku mihi, engari, mihi tonu ki a tātou katoa e ruitahi nei. Huri no, tēnā koutou, ka huri taku reo. Greetings this morning as we come to the final day of this conference. And so we welcome you, those who are online for the first time. We welcome you once, we welcome you twice, we welcome you thrice. To those who have returned to gather more berries from this tree of knowledge, we welcome you. And so, without further ado, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, rauranga tira mā, huri no te whare, huri no tēnā koutou, tūturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e,
tai ki e.
Morena koutou, ina mana, ina iwi, ina rangatira, no me hari mai, whakatū mai, Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you once again, Richie and Otene, for those inspirational words as we move into day 4, the final day of Building Nations. Now, I'll start with a bit of an early warning that even though it is the final day, we have not let up on the pace. We have a cracking programme for today. Shortly, we'll hear from Climate Change Commissioner, Professor Nicola Shadbolt. Later on, we'll hear from Shane Ellison on the Auckland Transport story, and then Victoria Johnson on building for broader outcomes. We'll close the morning session with a panel discussion on sustainable infrastructure. Moving into the afternoon, we'll hear from the Honourable David Clark, the Minister for Digital Economy and Communications, on the draft digital strategy. And later on, scientific futurist Dr. Catherine Ball will address emerging technologies, followed by a panel discussion on how the sector can benefit from Te Ahu Māori perspective. We'll finish the day with Dr. Ganesh Nana, who will give his perspective on how we can increase productivity in New Zealand. So before introducing Pip Best, who will lead the climate change session, I'd just like to remind you that we're very keen to have your feedback. So please can you use the discussion forum function to provide this to us. It's my very great pleasure now to introduce Pip Best. Pip is the Climate Change and Sustainability Service Leader for EY in New Zealand. She has worked with both the public and private sector in understanding the impacts of climate change and other sustainability issues such as emissions trading, green bonds, sustainable finance, impact as well as outcomes measurement. She has assisted sustainable financial products across Asia Pacific and has worked in New Zealand, Australia and the UK within the capital markets and sustainability roles. Pip is building a better world by helping organisations understand that polluting the air, dumping waste or underpaying a person has a cost beyond what is currently valued, and that by not valuing these costs, society will eventually stop supporting your business. Her clients most value that she understands both the financial and sustainability angles. Pip has a Bachelor of Engineering in Finance from the University of Melbourne. Welcome, Pip, and over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Tēnā koutou katoa. Briefly, about to introduce Nicola Shadbolt, who's going to provide us with an overview of the Climate Change Commission's role in providing advice to the government on climate change. But just to provide a little bit of context as we head into the session about the importance of climate change and the focus on the immediate future. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a special report on 1.5 degrees. It showed the importance of keeping global warming at 1.5 degrees by highlighting the devastating consequences of climate change if we reach 2 degrees of warming. If we do reach 2 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees, it would mean 1.7 billion more people would experience severe heat waves at least every 5 years. And if we do reach 2 degrees, it's estimated that plants, animals and insects would lose more than half their habitats, and almost half the world's species will be extinct by 2100. And if we do reach 2 degrees, 99% of coral reefs could decline, impacting 500 million people. This is why it's so important that we focus on the 1.5 degree target. And we've seen this increased focus in the near term really unfold at COP26, with Greta Thunberg's succinct summary of the conference's watered down blah, blah, blah. The IPCC estimates that global emissions need to halve by 2030 to keep the chance of 1.5 degrees alive. So what does accelerated decarbonisation of the next decade mean? In Al Gore's words, our world is now at the early stages of a sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution, but at the speed of the digital revolution. So to provide us with an overview of the Climate Change Commission's advice to government on the transition to a low emissions economy, I now have the pleasure of introducing Nicola Shadbolt. Professor Shadbolt is a farmer, forester, director and academic. As the recently appointed chairperson of Plant and Food Research and the former director of Fonterra Cooperative Group and Transit New Zealand, Professor Shadbolt has a strong understanding of implementing sustainability in businesses and a keen appreciation of how environmental management fits alongside social and economic imperatives. So please welcome Professor Shadbolt. And as a reminder, there will be time for Q&A at the end of Nicola's speech. So please do type in any questions you have during her session. So I'll now pass to Nicola.
Oh, good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today. I'm generate some good questions at the end as well. So go through first. So COP26 has been regularly in the last little while. I think one of the things that really sort of underpins, and Pip really highlighted it well in her introduction, is that so far the world has collectively not really got very far in terms of the targets that were set in the Paris Agreement. But luckily in the Paris Agreement, there is a bit of a ratchet mechanism that says every 5 years you need to get together and refresh those commitments and hopefully extend them. And that is what happened. New Zealand did commit to strengthening its NDC. It initially had pledged to cut emissions by 39% below the 05 levels. Now it's committed to 50% on the 05 levels. So that's a 48% reduction on current levels. So that is a strong commitment that we're making. But the commitment is one thing, ambition is great, but really we've got to see what people are going to do, both government and individuals and businesses. So we're interested to see the government's plan that's going to be announced, the emissions reduction plan in May, and obviously really keen to see what's going to be going on in non-government circles as well. So our recommendation, for those of you that are less aware, our task as a Climate Change Commission, one of our first tasks was actually to put together our report, which translates as "the time is now," Inia Tonu Nei, really to say, you know, we've actually got to start making things happen as soon as possible, seize those opportunities. Into the draft of that, so we heard from many and incorporated that feedback, and really what we're looking for is this transition to this thriving, climate resilient, low emissions Aotearoa, and we need action to get to that. Industries, businesses and individuals can seize the opportunities available to them, and that really is one of the feedbacks we had, is that people saw in this report something for all. There really is something that everybody in New Zealand, individually and collectively, can do. So moving on to the next slide. Adapting to climate change, there's two sides to climate change that I think, particularly for this audience, is very relevant. One is the mitigation and the other is the adaptation. Climate adaptation is our ability to cope with the changes in climate that will happen, are already happening in many places. And one of our tasks, in fact, is to monitor that response. So first, the government will pull together the government's National Adaptation Plan in 2024. And our task will actually be to monitor that response to that plan in terms of how things actually pan out. So yes, we have the mitigation, and we have a number of things that need to be happened to reduce emissions. And once that plan comes out in 2022, we will also have a task to monitor that. So we're a little different in terms of many other commissions, is that yes, we wrote our report and government responded, but we can actually not necessarily take them to task, but we can certainly ask. They have to say why they're not going to follow the advice that we've given, so that and then we monitor what they do. So there's a lot of checks and balances have been built into the Act to ensure it happens. Last year, the Ministry of Environment published the first National Climate Risk Assessment, which gives the first national picture of the risks that we face from climate change, ranging from, gosh, all sorts that we've already seen some, and it's the risk to our ecosystems and communities, buildings, financial system that's right across the board. It lays the foundation for the National Adaptation Plan that's due next year, and that 2024 in the Commission, we will produce the first progress report that monitors that, and that'll be repeated every 2 years. And then in 2026, we have the pleasure of being able to carry out the second National Climate Risk Assessment, and that's then updated every 6 years. So just that helps understand a little bit of the tasks that we have ahead of ourselves. So if we're looking at in your area in particular, this whole area of the built environment, there's two most significant risks to that identified in this first climate change risk assessment was first the risk to the availability and quality of potable water. And we know that the changes that are there and are coming in terms of rainfall, temperature, drought, extreme weather events, sea level rising, all of these will have an impact on that potable water. And then, which is really an infrastructure issue, and that's very much in the press at the moment. And then also the risks in terms of buildings from these extreme weather events, as well as the drought, the ongoing sea level rise, and the other. So there's a limited capacity to adapt existing buildings from some of these, but certainly ensuring that the build, as we move into new builds and as we evolve urban form, that we are actually taking these things into account. Other risks in the built environment highlighted in that first risk assessment are landfills and contaminated sites, and we saw that on the west coast with the flooding down there and the fact that it unearthed some rubbish pits that then ended up out on the beaches into the sea. The other infrastructure that's at risk are wastewater and stormwater systems, and again we've seen some of ours challenged within New Zealand already. Ports, airports, associated infrastructure, critical for supplies, for ensuring that we can get through these events when they happen. So how well they are built to cope with such things is really important. And then lastly, the transport networks and the electricity infrastructure. When we have a power cut in the valley where I live, we can be 5 days without power. So, having the system in place to ensure that we've got power or we've got something to be able to not only cook our food, but more importantly, milk our cows and look after our stock and run our business is critical. And transport network works the same. I mean, when I was on the transit board, it was some time ago, and at that time we were buying the land for Transmission Gully because of this huge risk. If there had been an earthquake, Wellington would be cut off on the current roading structure. So I'm really pleased to see that road is finally almost there. So that takes us on really well into the sort of the cities and towns side of things. So the whole aspect of urban form, function, and development. And this is where the mitigation and the adaptation sort of combine, because if we can find an urban design that will actually enable us to reduce emissions, and that is by changing the way that people live to a large extent, it is about their use, how the transport networks or what transport is available, how people function within those sorts of cities. So we're looking at sort of building compact cities that are livable, have low emissions, and are resilient to climate change in terms of they are built in such a form that as these shocks come, they are better able to cope. We need to design compact communities that people want to live in, with infrastructure that enables easy access to rapid, frequent transit. The days of just having to drive everywhere to everything should be minimized if we can actually work into a system whereby it is so much easier to either walk, take public transport, or cycle. And that will lead to significant emission reductions. We are one of the highest in the OECD in terms of our use of cars, and not, it's understandable. We're a very sparsely populated country, but there are pockets in the cities in particular where we can actually address this and enable us to reduce that car use and reduce those emissions. We need to have these compact low emission cities that are designed for changing climate. So not building in at-risk areas in terms of whether that's coastal erosion or whether sea level rise issues could address or could cause problems. We really need to make changes to reduce the risk and vulnerability in our existing built-up areas as well. And that's, thinking even of things like, extreme rainfall, it's as much about the natural channels of water flow as the stormwater systems. Water will find a way to get through, and we need to be aware of what that way might be before we start building infrastructure, or even we look at what's there and how it needs to cope. In terms of making these cities a desirable place, it's also about green spaces, easy access to leisure, well-designed homes and apartments. I mean, basically, it's making the world of tomorrow somewhere that is quite different, and somewhere that people want to be. So now if I move on to one of my favourites, which is transport. Having been a little bit of a lone voice on transit all those years ago, where I used to plug away for public transport and got told in no uncertain terms that Aucklanders don't do public transport, and that's why we had to just keep on going with these roads. It's heartening to see that Aucklanders are now doing public transport. I had a son living there till quite recently, and he never drove to work. He was either on a train or on a bus, or he was walking, or he was cycling, and it was more of the norm. So that is the future. In terms of cities, we need to seriously address that with urgency. Actually, we're way behind in terms of some other, we compare ourselves with cities around the world. There is an opportunity to decarbonise transport by 2050 by investing in the right infrastructure, encouraging behavioural changes, and adopting technologies such as EV vehicles that are available now and are also improving fast. So for other parts of the country where public transport is less relevant, for me, where I live, I always say I happily would walk or cycle to meetings, but I would be incredibly late. I live 30k out of town. I have to have a vehicle to get to where I need to go. And there's other places around New Zealand where, again, the public transport isn't an option, but different ways of living are. I mean, I don't think I've been to town once this week yet because everything's now on Zoom. But also, the use of the EVs is something that is a key part of that. And that's why, the announcements have already been made in that area. Beginning work to decarbonise heavy transport and freight, moving more to rail and sea. Has had a very interesting meeting, or attended, a meeting up in Auckland not so long ago, where they were talking about, the opportunities for moving for freight shipping coastal shipping rather, for the freight and the article in the newspaper around the ferry, electric operated ferries. So yes, those options, but whether it's biofuels, electricity, green hydrogen, it's making sure that we're really starting to work out ways to decarbonise heavy transport and freight. I'm just going to go back to Auckland briefly, and I started with them, so I'm sorry, Aucklanders, if you feel I'm picking on you, but the transport sector is the largest source of emissions in Auckland, 35% of the region's greenhouse gas emissions. And so decarbonising Auckland will contribute significantly to decarbonising New Zealand. So it is something that it would be great to have there. Auckland City Council's climate plan has set a goal to reduce net emissions by 50% for 2030, 0 to 2050. And to achieving that first goal will require a 64% reduction in transport emissions, which is a fundamental shift in how Aucklanders travel. So that will need to see the increased uptake of public transport, cycling and walking. more remote working. I don't think that would be good to tell that to Aucklanders at the moment. I think you've had enough of remote working for the last few months. But once we get back to a semi-normal state, then some of that might stick, and it would be useful for the emissions. And then obviously the increased number of EVs and other low emission vehicles on the road. And all of this links back to that urban development, urban form, because public transport is integral to that urban form development and design. So then onto electricity. We need to make sure our infrastructure is designed to be resilient. It will play a hugely important role in New Zealand. Electricity will, for reducing those emissions. We are incredibly fortunate that we do have so much renewable energy already. That's part of our history. We're not big coal producers like our neighbour, and water was was the most logical form, and we've got our hydro, and it's wonderful to have that as the starting point. But we need more in that area, so we really need to be looking at that renewable energy build to the point when we are going to be relying so much on electricity for transport, for process heat, as buildings switch away from fossil fuels. There's also the suggestion that as we get warmer, people will be running their air conditioning units more. I'd like to think they open windows and find other ways of cooling down. But yeah, there is this inference that as the climate is changing, we will need more energy, not less. Our advice recommended a considered and coordinated approach to how energy is used and produced across public and private sectors. And in particular, the government develop a comprehensive energy strategy to ensure actions to decarbonise are considered across the whole energy system. I think that emphasis is really important, because this is a national issue, and we do need to be able to have a very comprehensive approach that will actually bring all of our opportunities together. In terms of electricity in the mitigation, we've talked about electricity in terms of the mitigation stage, reducing those emissions. In terms of adaptation, I think this is one area that also requires a lot of thought. It's a little bit like the rethinking an urban form. How our distribution network, we're only as good probably as our distribution network allows, and that's why we're out for 5 days up our valley when there's a power cut. It's not because the power's not available, it's because the lines are down. And so as for a developed world, we have an awful lot of above ground distribution, and as climate change gets worse, as we're being told it will do, we are very much at risk, and not only in terms of lack of power, but if there's anything that could trigger issues out of electricity. And we just heard in the news today around the fires down south that were triggered by a pole. I don't know whether it's a pole fuse, but certainly a spark from above ground distribution. So there's a lot to do in that area. And that increased investment in energy efficiency is also a key part, where we can leverage our extensive renewable energy to decarbonise areas like transport and industry. And the main goal is to reduce that use of fossil fuel use in buildings and in processing. Now, in terms of building better, I think this is, I know I've talked already about urban form and other aspects, but this is really now talking more around the relating back, to the Infrastructure Commission work, because there's a very clear connection between the Infrastructure Commission report. It recently released its draft strategy on how infrastructure can overcome the challenges it will face over the next 30 years. And we need to get our infrastructure right if we're going to meet these climate targets. So the infrastructure we're planning today may take 10 years or more to consent. I think this is the other issue, is that we really do need that very long-term view. So we've got, it could be 10 years for what we're planning today by the time we've gone through consents, builds, commissions, and everything else. But we're talking about, and that building might last for another 100 years. So whatever we do now must really lock in, or must not lock us into high emission paths, high emission constructs, and an increasing exposure to the impacts of climate change. So it's important that this really starts quite soon in terms of ensuring that we've got that climate or the low emission build, as well as the resilience in terms of structure and how that will be useful for how we handle the future. So it's not just what we build, but whether we build, how we build, where we build, and how long we design it to last. It's also about looking at existing infrastructure and where efficiency gains can be made or resilience can be strengthened. And to a certain extent, we've been doing a lot of that with the response to the earthquakes. There's going back to existing buildings, checking, testing, not necessarily rebuilding them, but certainly doing all the necessary work that's required to ensure that they can cope for that shock, because we know about earthquakes, but now we're talking about other shocks and the building infrastructure that really needs to be able to cope with that. So, nearly there. We all have a part to play in this. We all need to get involved and lead low emissions, climate resilient infrastructure. Our work is to provide independent evidence-based advice and monitoring to help reduce those emissions and adapt for change. So that will contribute to that, and so will the work of the Infrastructure Commission. But infrastructure is a long game, and so we really need to be making those decisions. The decisions we make now really do have to be as right as they possibly can be. The government will come through with their emissions reduction plan in May 2022, and in there will be their response, which will be very helpful in terms of how we can evolve. But I'm witnessing industries almost, a step ahead. There are industries already doing things. The change by getting involved and ahead, seizing those opportunities to adapt those low emission solutions as early as possible. And I think there is evidence of that already. And there's also a chance to be innovative. We're at the beginning of the transition, so we can take up new low emission technology and business practices from now, developing the skills, creating low emissions products and services. And because there is so much building going on, it's actually a great place to sort of, set the tone. It's almost like, there was a wave of houses back in the 50s and they're recognizable. There's a wave of buildings in the 70s, also recognizable, and there's another wave coming now, and it's, this is our chance to actually make a difference, do something that will survive the test of time. So well-planned infrastructure investments will unlock that emission reductions and build a thriving climate resilient economy. Poorly planned infrastructure or short-sighted investments can and make more people vulnerable. So we need good policy, and that'll become a plan that takes a long-term view to infrastructure efficiency and resilience. We need good tools and guidelines that account for climate change and cost-benefit analysis and business case development, including consistent shadow pricing for long-term carbon costs. And we need accessible, robust, and up-to-date data and information to inform our adaptation strategies. So every action counts. We all need to take responsibility for our own carbon footprints and our everyday actions and choices. Our individual actions at home, combined with individual actions across the world, add up. And at home, we can think of things like how we manage waste. New Zealand has one of the worst waste metrics in the OECD. Recycling, what we clad our homes with. Are we using fossil fuel-based products what we clad ourselves with? Are we wearing fossil-based fuel products? So on and so forth. There's so much, and how we live our lives in terms of, you know, what transport we use, and there's a vast array of things that as individuals we can do. So the advice of both the Climate Change Commission and the Infrastructure Commission is now in the public arena, and the evidence of the interdependencies between infrastructure and climate is clear. We know what we need to do. So thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. And we do have some very interesting questions coming through. So I've tried to kind of group them together. So hopefully I will get to most of them that I've been able to read so far. The first question, Nicola, is around, well, there's a couple of questions around policy settings. There's one comment about the ERP being kind of widely panned for its lack of urgency, potentially, as want of a better word, and that policy is actually moving quite slowly since the passing of the Zero Carbon Act. And I guess secondly to that, there is other questions in the chat just about the the heated economic debate about whether we should just be focusing on market-based mechanisms such as the NZETS as the policy solution for climate change, while the Climate Change Commission has obviously recommended a very broad suite of different interventions. So I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on both of that. Are we moving too slowly in actually putting the plan together, and should it just be focused on market-based solutions, or why have you, I guess, suggested a broader suite of policies?
Okay, in terms of the too slowly, well, it has been put out. The date has been moved from when the plan was supposed to have come out. And I guess that's possibly a reflection of the extent of work that needs to be done to pull that plan together. So the document that's come out so far is one very much, this is outside our hands. So we did our document, put out our advice, and then the government, it's now in the government's hands. So we can't change the speed with which they pull theirs together. But I think there is a lot to be done, and I think that will take some time in terms of getting their feedback from what they're doing, consulting, and then pulling through sound, sensible government policy. Now, I don't think any of us want this policy to be rushed to the point when it's not right. And so, you know, good policy does take time, unfortunately, but it's fortunate as well, because then it stands the test of time. So it's probably more important we make this through, and so then when they do come out, you know, it's really good stuff. So I guess I'm less concerned about that. I think there's an awful lot people can do anyway in the meantime. We don't necessarily need to wait for some of this. In terms of the levers, much into, if you like, almost sort of behavioural science areas, there's been quite a lot of work in terms of, well, how high does the price of carbon have to go before someone will stop, for example, driving their car? And actually it's quite high. And for someone like me, it won't stop me, because I can't. It has to be recognition that there are other ways, or other policies are also required to enable us to reduce our emissions. Remember, our purpose here is to stop or to reduce global warming. And so we need to ensure that there are methods by which we can reduce that warming, and it does require a suite of policies over and above just straight, you know, the market will win, because I'm a huge supporter of market forces, and but I do understand that when there are times when actually that doesn't work. And plus you can have market forces, if you've got one price over a whole raft of things. It could be strong in some areas, like carbon prices. You know, moving the rate they currently are will, you know, displace vast tracts of food producing land because of, you know, with the tree aspect, but not get people out of cars. So, you know, it's triggering one thing, but not another. So The screen is frozen, has it?
No, yeah, you're still there. If you can hear me, we can.
Okay.
I think we can still hear you, Nicola.
Yep. Is there another question?
Oh, sorry. So following on from that, there's a lot of, I guess, questions around the physical aspects that you touched on at the start. One specific question that seems to have a lot of likes is around should the resource management system make infrastructure aimed at increasing resilience and mitigation a permitted activity to reduce the lead-in times?
Sorry, say that again. So the Resource Management Act should do what?
Should make infrastructure aimed at increasing resilience and mitigation a permitted activity to reduce lead-in times. I'm not sure if that was a specific recommendation of the Commission or potentially a useful suggestion by the audience.
Okay, so RMA, which relates to regional councils and whether activities, whether you're building, whether you're doing anything, require consents or not. So by saying they're a permitted activity, it's saying that they would not require consent. In other words, you could just go ahead and do it. And therefore that would speed the process up, because if you are trying to get things done, if you have to go through the local councils to get these consents, it does take time. So yeah, so the question is, if we were doing things that were providing this, then could we do that without having to get consents? So that's something that the local councils draw up their rules around that, and the RMA is currently under review, so that there's quite a lot of extra work being done in terms of how those delays can be addressed. I know it's front of mind with the RMA review, but that's outside our scope. That's certainly not something that we've been asked to comment on. But I think in terms of to put the RMA and the delays to one side, I would like to think that the local governments are seriously going to identify methods of build, methods of form, urban form, whatever you like to call it, that will actually lead to a lower emitting and a more resilient future. So that's sort of with those sorts of wording is in our report, in terms of really let's make sure we have those thoughts front of mind when some of these consents are happening. Now, whether they're permitted or one that has to go through a consent process, that's another story, and that's an RMA one. But in terms of what they allow or what they encourage through their local rules, it would be great if we could have that focus on, what of these builds or of this infrastructure what is its impact going to be on the climate, on the globe, if you like, in terms of emissions, and then how will it be able to cope with the shocks of climate that are forecast.
And maybe just to follow on that, in terms of the adaptation challenge that you highlighted at the start of your speech, in particular when you went through some of the significant physical risks, the economic analysis that the Climate Change Commission did looked to exclude the costs of those physical impacts. So I'm just, I guess, curious as to is that the case, and if so, if those were included, would the reader be seeing a very different outcome, I guess, in terms of the economic costs?
I can't answer that question. I'm sorry. I'd have to go back to the people who did those models. So yeah, I'm not too sure, to be honest. Sorry.
That's okay. So there's another question here about diversity, and it asks: Does the Climate Change Commission did the Climate Change Commission consider all New Zealand communities, and were they engaged in the process, and did it consider future generations in the process in your work?
Yeah, absolutely, because climate is an intergenerational issue. And so, there was a lot of conversation around, sometimes it's easy to solve today's problems with, if you like, a band-aid or a quick fix. But if that then jeopardizes the next generation, you've actually not achieved anything, because all you're doing is pushing the proverbial down the road. And, at some point, the next generation or our great-grandchildren will then need to pick up that and think, well, thanks, Mum, Dad, Granddad, Nan, whoever else, for leaving us in this place. So, that intergenerational focus was very, very much there. And it probably came through strongest in our recommendations on the forestry side of things. Because actually it would be very easy for us just to blanket plant everything and address our emissions by the fact that we can increase our sequestration. But if we get it wrong, and especially with the trees that by a certain age they stop sequestering, if we plant a lot of the short life trees, then suddenly, by 2050 or just after, the next generation will be back to square one again and have to then find new solutions. So our emphasis very much was on, let's address gross emissions, let's address reducing the emissions from source, the fossil fuel, the use of cars, how we're building, all that sort of thing, to make sure that we're actually pulling that back, and that then reduces the amount of sequestration we need anyway. And then let's also look at sequestration that perhaps is intergenerational. So if you can get, if there's areas of land that can revert back to native bush, and that will then carry through for hundreds of years, that will serve the future generations' need. Because unfortunately, we will not get all of our long life gases back to zero. There's some that just won't. I mean, nitrous oxide is one as an example. And so we will always need some sequestration. I mean, that's just a fact. And so therefore we need that to be there for those future generations.
I might then just end on one last question, just kind of leading into that future generations piece. And this is another question from the audience. What would be your one key challenge to Kiwis?
I think getting behind it, determine what it is that you individually can do. I think for far too long we've kept on blaming others. That it's their fault. It's their fault. It's nothing to do with me. And I think there's something in this for everyone. I think we can all look at where we live, what we buy, how we buy. There's a lot of industries where I think people are unaware of the impact the industries that they're connected to and how they might be impacting on the environment. So I think it's looking at individually, what do we do? How do we live our lives, especially our purchasing patterns, and then look more collectively as a community. What could we do differently? Are there ways in which we could live our lives that would also have less impact? And so if we start from within and start from the one, that'll build to the many, rather than constantly waiting for somebody else to tell us either what to do and then we either agree or disagree, or waiting for someone else to do it for us, because we've actually got to pull into this as fast as we can and start as an individual.
Thanks, Nicola. And I just echo those thoughts. We all have a sphere of influence, and there's a lot of comments about kind of waiting for policy, but in the meanwhile, we can use that sphere of influence, which particularly is our consumer decisions, etc., to make a change as soon as possible. So thank you very much for both your talk and your answers to the audience's questions. I think now, Margaret, am I passing back to you?
Yes. Yes, you are. Thank you, Pip. Thank you. And thank you, Nicola and Pip, for getting day 4 off to such a great start. Thank you also to the audience for the fantastic questions that we had. I keep saying we probably could have had Nicola talk to us for the rest of the day. Just a few pull-outs for me, particularly in the questioning as well. But the world is changing. We need to focus on that 1.5 degree target. That there has been a lot of words, a lot of commitment. Now we need to see the outcomes. But it's actually down to each of us individually to do things and not just wait for others to take that action. And then just listening to the final question and response from Professor Shadbolt, it reminded me a little bit of the famous Gandhi quote, which I will not get completely right this morning, but around, if not you, then who? And I think that really applies today in terms of our actions in respect of climate change. And the fact is that we all do have that role to play. Now, talking about roles to play, I am just going to launch the live poll again, which is the last time for this conference. Just want to really focus on what are those areas that you would like us to focus on in respect of our strategy and going forward from FY22 and beyond. Whilst that poll is being launched, let's see if we can multitask at the same time. I say once again, thank you to Nicola and Pip for getting day 4 off to such a fabulous start. And thank you to EY for sponsoring the session. Coming up shortly, we'll be hearing from Shane Ellison, who will share the Auckland Transport story, and that will be starting at 8:55. And I think, Shane, if you've been listening, there are a few comments and actions coming from Professor Shadbolt's talk that I'm sure we'd all want you to comment on, particularly around the role of Auckland Transport in reducing the carbon emissions. Just looking now at our poll, interesting that we've still from day 1 stuck on those 3, which are the infrastructure deficit, the attraction of talent and retention of skills, and climate change. The percentages have moved, taking climate change into that top position. But very clear message from all of you, from our members, that those are the areas that you really want us to focus on. So thank you very much for your input and providing that feedback to us. As I said at the start, we very much value your feedback, and it would be great if you could continue to provide that to us throughout the rest of the day. I'm going to draw this session now to a conclusion, just quickly checking my notes and I've not missed anything. No, all good. And the next session will kick off at 8:55 with Shane Ellison and sharing the Auckland Transport story. Matawai, and thank you.